Hi everyone, welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism. Today I think we're up to class number 14, it's quite a few months now, and we're of course continuing with our reading of The Way to Buddhahood by Venerable Master In Chuan. It's a modern classic that covers really the entirety of Dharma practice. It's kind of an interesting book in that kind of sets the scene for what's really our 20th century revision and sort of update on how Chinese Buddhism looks at Buddhism in general. Haven't really talked about this too much. Actually, maybe I'll just start today by talking about some of the sort of broader ideas. Of course, the main content for today is to look into the second of the three trainings of morality. So last week we looked at generosity or giving, and today we'll be looking at called morality, or often we translate it as precepts. And of course the topic after that is meditation. So these are the three bases of generating merit, which forms a really important foundation for all sorts of practice, be it lay practice or monastic practice. Anyway, like I was saying, some of the bigger context for the book itself is, when Buddhism first arrived in China, of course it came in, we usually say it came from India, but a lot of it really came from somewhere we better describe as being Central Asia. Sort of didn't just go India to China, it went through India and then came through two main channels. One, it went north along the Silk Road and then into China from the west, and the other way is it came from the seas in the south through Southeast Asia and up the coast into China. Anyway, what first came in was really forms of Indian Buddhism, and the Chinese interacted with this and kind of digested this, and of course they came up with their own traditions, or what we often call schools, but I think it's best translated as traditions. We talk about the Pure Land, we talk about Tian Tai, we talk about Chan, Huayan, etc., etc. And after these were set up, particularly in the Tang and the Song dynasties about 1,000 years ago, due to history and whatever, some of those connections with India kind of became a little more broken, and so there's far less new Buddhism coming in from South Asia, from India in particular. But then these traditions of Chinese Buddhism developed by themselves, and so if you came up to like even 100 years ago, or maybe a bit over 100 years ago, Chinese Buddhism was still thinking of Buddhism through these systems of interpretation that they had come up with themselves in China. But in the 20th century, the world is a much smaller place. There's a lot more global and international interaction from the Chinese side, in particular, a lot of interaction with the Japanese scholarship and Japanese new takes, and a real different understanding of the history of Buddhism. And so there was this pushback towards, hey, it's Buddhism, it's the teaching of Buddha, and this is from India, and these teachings in India, some of them were like earlier and some of them were later. There's a whole development there. And so this is an area where Venerable Master In Chuan was so influential. He moved away from the Chinese interpretations. He wasn't like, I'm Chan school or I'm Tian Tai school, but really like, hey, let's get back to the Indian texts themselves and try to sort it out from there. And so while The Way to Buddhahood, if you read the full book, it's got a lot of references to sutras, be they early sutras or be they Mahayana sutras, and also a number of particularly Mahayana commentaries as well. But one thing you find is they're all Indian in source and origin. There's very little stuff that comes, the sort of native Chinese interpretations of Buddhism. So that's kind of like an interesting idea. I think it's worth like sharing this with people, because often people that might hear about Chinese Buddhism, they kind of get told it's kind of similar to Japanese Buddhism. They want to ask things like, oh, it must belong to this school or that school. But really in the last 50 years, things are really quite different. Those schools, those ideas, which started forming like 1,000 years ago, and they've continued, but in the last maybe 50 years or even last century, they're not really the right framework for understanding the Chinese take on Buddhism. Okay, enough of that blah blah blah. Let's get into our text. What have we got today? Okay, so we can see here that we're now up to the second one, the meritorious action of morality. Last week we looked at generosity or giving, and dana. Immorality here, the term in Sanskrit or Pali is shila. So let's have a little look at verse number 48 first of all. 克己以利他，坚忍持境界. Restraining oneself to benefit others, have firm tolerance to uphold pure morality. So, I mean, this is just a real general kind of overview phrase, isn't it? We've got this idea of 克己. This actually comes from, it's kind of an adaptation of a Chinese idiom. So here, 克, to restrain oneself. And often people think of like restraint. I think maybe a bit of Freudian psychology means we think the idea of like restraint must be a bad thing. It's sort of like suppression. But I mean, that's a Freudian take. I don't think necessarily Buddhists, well, I'm pretty sure the Buddha doesn't agree with this at all. You got this term samvara, which kind of means restraint. Also the word vinaya, which is of course the word used for the monastic discipline, monastic precepts, also has a sense of restraint as well. You're going to go do something negative. Hey, restrain yourself. And that isn't a bad thing. That's not like a suppression. I mean, if you've got that intention, you have to be aware of it, but you also have to be aware that like indulging in that is going to be detrimental for yourself and other people. So, one of the ideas is, of course, hey, rather than do things which hurt other people, restrain yourself. Just refrain. And this also means then 坚忍持境界. Okay, so 坚 is like, you're going to be kind of like firm. 忍 has this kind of like sense of tolerance. When sort of situations that might like tempt you or, tempt you into something to sort of indulge in your desires, or in anger, you've got to 忍. You've got to like bear with that. Don't follow through on it. 持 is just uphold the pure precepts or pure morality. So it kind of implies that, like, yes, in order to uphold these basic precepts and Buddhist ethical ideals, yeah, you do have to have a bit of restraint, and you do have to have, kind of like some, like take hold of yourself, refrain from those kinds of behavior. Now, at first, that might be a little bit forced. It might take quite a bit of effort, and the Buddha acknowledges that, and he doesn't say that's a bad thing. This is definitely not just like indulge yourself all the time. If it feels good, do it. No, certainly not. But as you progress in your practice, it goes from something that you first have to like almost like force yourself to do, or you have to consciously do, and it will become more and more something that's easier. And of course, once you really get down to it, and the mind in turn is purified. So remember, morality is dealing with your external actions. So when you say restraint here, or firm tolerance, it's kind of physical restraint, or including your mouth. Just keep your mouth shut. Don't say that. But as you go through, and you no longer have even those intentions to do that, of course, it's not really a matter of like hold yourself, bite your tongue. You just won't do it anyway. So, to give an example, simple example for someone. Okay, let's say you decide you're gonna be vegetarian. You don't want to eat meat. At first, you might go through a phase. You might like eating meat or sausages or whatever it is. You might smell those things. You might think, oh, but it smells so good. Your body has physical reactions. Your mouth waters or whatever. You might have like, no, don't do it. Stop looking at it. Stop smelling it. And you have to restrain yourself. You have to use a bit of effort to like, curb those desires. But, after some time being a vegetarian, you're just not interested. You don't have to restrain yourself. I mean, for myself, I don't have to restrain myself to not eat meat. I just have no interest in doing that at all. So it takes a bit of work, and that's the same with anything. You want to develop a new habit. You want to improve. You want to get better. You've got to train yourself in it. It takes a bit of work. But once you've readapted, it's easier. It's much easier. Okay, let's have a look then at the next one. What's the next line here? Verse 48 is kind of a bit shorter. It's just these two short mini sentences. And then 49 is kind of a bit longer here. So bear with me. Verse 49. 以己度他情，莫杀莫行障，悟道无邪淫，我作虚诳语，饮酒百众的，佛子应受持. Using oneself as example, assess the feelings of others. Do not kill or engage in violence. do not steal or engage in sexual misconduct, do not make false statements. As consuming intoxicants destroys many virtues, Buddhists should also uphold this precept. Okay, so we've got a few ideas here. The bulk of this, of course, is just going through, the 5 precepts. This is really just an introduction to the 5 precepts. But the first line is kind of pretty interesting because it kind of explains one of the rationales behind refraining from these actions. So, 以己度他情, using oneself as an example. So it's literally by way of oneself. 度 is like to measure or assess. 他 is the other, 情, their feelings. So this is basically to say, sort of along the lines of, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, or don't do unto others as you would have others not do unto you. When we engage in an action, you want to insult someone, you think, would I like to be insulted? And you go, no. Okay, therefore, don't insult someone else, right? It's a real basic thing. I mean, most adults have this ability. I'm not actually sure about that. I would like to think that most adults have this ability to do it. Irrespective of whether others do, this is a really important practice for us as Buddhist practitioners, right? You gotta flip it around. So, what would I like someone to do that to me? You think, well, yeah, that would be nice. Okay, that's a nice thing. Let me do that to others. Of course, it doesn't always work that way because sometimes what one person wants and what another person wants are not always the same thing. Like would I like durian chocolate? Yes, I would. Let me buy it for all my friends. All your friends that don't want durian. So it doesn't quite work. Okay, that's a bad counter example. But the basic principle, I think you understand, right? So it's the same thing for negative actions. Would I like somebody to say that about me? Well, no. So I shouldn't say that about others. I always think of this, for like the speech, for example. If people are gossiping or saying bad things about others, I'm always thinking like, just as you're saying that, those people are doing exactly the same thing to me in turn. So do I want that? No. So time to shut my mouth and not say bad things about other people. So that's a basic principle, and I like this principle because they're not just about, not killing, violence, stealing, sexual misconduct, false statements, or intoxicants. It's far broader. There can be lots of things that don't fall within the 5 precepts that we really still shouldn't engage in. And you can't be kind of like a rules lawyer and just like, well, I didn't break the rules to the letter, therefore anything I do is fine. It's not that simple, right? You gotta think in more general terms. And you've also got to think the 5 precepts, they are broad guidelines. Now you do have, say in the monastic veneer, a lot of detail for the monastic situation of these rules, and lots of like literally case examples. Oh, in this case, and this happened in these circumstances, and this was okay, or in this situation and these circumstances, this wasn't okay. You got a lot of like really rich detail there, but when it comes to just the 5 precepts and the sutras and pretty much all the texts, they don't really try to flesh out every single possible example. You do have to like use your wisdom, use the basic principles to assess the situation. And it's also important to note that like not every case is exactly the same. Take the first precept of killing or taking life. That doesn't mean that the karma involved in swatting a mosquito off your arm versus the horrible planned murder of someone, because they're both taking life, therefore they're both karmically equal. They're not. I mean, they're equal in that they're taking life. But in terms of the results, massively different. The emotional content involved, etc., 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 is usually different. So you've got these 5 precepts. I don't know if we really need to go through them one by one. I do like it here that Venerable Inshun hasn't just put in not killing, he's also added in engaging in violence, right? More xing zhang. So zhang is like a staff, it's literally like beating, but it's violence is the basic principle here. All of these precepts, I used to teach these a lot, particularly FGU would have these sort of like Buddhist ethics practicum classes. And an important way to look at these precepts and think about them is, when you talk to students in particular, usually they want to know, is this actually breaking the precept, or is this actually not breaking the precepts? And like I was saying, I mean, there are guidelines for that. There's these so-called like 5 conditions. If the 5 conditions are fulfilled, then it's considered breaking. And if they're not, or only like 4 of them, or if even one of them is missing, then it's not a breach. But that doesn't mean to say that if you don't have all 5, you're not engaging in some negative action. I mean, you can just, even the thought, you've got the mental intention to do something without engaging in the practice, means you haven't broken that precept, but even thinking about it is an unwholesome state of mind, right? So anyway, what are the 5? So let's say we take it for violence. So the first one is that there is the target of that, so the person to whom the violence is enacted. There's also the perception or the knowledge, the understanding, perception is probably the best word, that they are a target. So like if you've got like this person in front of you, and you know that they are a living person, or you think they are a living person, because this means like if you, let's say like hunters in the woods, and maybe they think they're shooting at a tree, but they're actually shooting at another person. So they did shoot someone, and they might have even like injured or killed them, but they didn't think that they were a person. So that's a very different situation. It's like they didn't intend to kill a person. The third one is the intention to engage in that act. Intention's not enough. They also have to have the action itself. And then finally, the fifth one is that the action is experienced. So like they are actually killed, or they are actually hurt, or the item is actually stolen, for example. So there's these 5 basic principles for each of the precepts in turn. So we've just gone through, so like killing. So that is like, say, an animal. You understand it's a living creature. You have this intention to slaughter it. You undertake some action to slaughter it, and they are actually slaughtered by that action. If these are made, then one can say that that precept is broken. Similar for violence, of course, except that simply the intention is that to enact violence and they are somehow struck or hurt. For theft, it's you've got an object that belongs to someone else. You know it's an object that belongs to someone else. You have the intention, you do the action. And note the action can be a range of things. In fact, note also for all of these, it's not just that one engages in that oneself. It can also mean that one instructs other people to do it for you. That's, like a mafia boss giving the order, take him out. And then the mafia minions go and do the job. The mafia boss is equally culpable. Actually, in many ways more so, because they gave the order. We're talking about theft. And then last of all, the object is taken. Sexual misconduct, it's some other living being that's not your partner, and even what classifies as a partner. Sexual misconduct is a bit more complicated, because in the older texts, sort of what classifies as appropriate partners, it's sexual misconduct. So it's meaning there are certain sorts of sexual behavior that are okay, and other types of behavior that are not okay. You'll often hear by, like, at least in Taiwan, and I think elsewhere too, that it's interpreted as like a partner other than your husband or wife. That's a pretty standard interpretation. You'll often get that like from the Christian side, right? So extramarital sex is a no-no. But if you actually look in the sutras themselves, it's not quite that simple. Of course, even the whole definition of what constitutes a husband or a wife in ancient society is very different from what we constitute it now. And so there can be various other people, people that are like underage, which includes they're under the protection of others. So like a minor is under the protection of their parents, for example. Many cases like this, but it's not quite so simple as just sort of one's own spouse. There's a whole group of other people that are sort of, they're just not prescribed. So you do have to look into that one in a bit more detail. It's not quite as simple as what some people think, but the biggest difficulty with that precept is simply the ways in which relationships and stuff were kind of conceived in ancient society. It's the same if you look in the Old Testament, different types of wives include like woman captured in battle. I mean, nowadays, I don't think we're going to call that a wife. That just sounds absolutely horrible. but that was considered like a type of wife in those days. So we need to kind of think about it, and I think a good way is basically to say, if in a modern society that's considered acceptable, that's okay, and if it's not, then it's not okay, right? So like minors and other people that don't consent, etc., etc., that is obviously sexual misconduct. Okay, and then we also have speech. So what are the five? So you've got a person in front of you that can understand you. You know that they're a person that can understand you. You've got the intention to deceive them or lie to them. You do something, say something or whatever to lie to them. And now the last one's a bit trickier here, because we couldn't just say they are deceived, because that means you lie to someone, but if they see through your lie, then you're not lying. That doesn't make sense. So they understand what you're saying. Whether or not they are deceived by it or not, then that constitutes. These are the 5 conditions for false speech. And then, okay, back to our text here. Okay, these are the first 4, right, up to making false statements. And then we've got in the last line here, right, 饮酒百种的, as consuming intoxicants destroys many virtues, Buddha should also uphold this precept. Now, it's usually described in kind of Buddhist technical terms, Buddhist ethical technical terms, that those first 4 precepts, remember here we've actually got 5 because we've got killing and violence, are called precepts by nature. Now this is a very important concept. Precepts by nature, in Chinese that's 性戒, mean that action must have some unwholesome state of mind behind it as a driving force. Any killing, any violence even, theft, lying, false statements, sexual misconduct, etc. They've always got some driving force behind it, negative driving force. Now, that can be quite complicated. Maybe we might normally think, oh, well, murder's got like anger behind it, or murder's got, violence got anger behind it. Sexual misconduct has got lust behind it, but it's not actually that simple. It can be a range of other mental states as well. Actually, most of the killing that takes place by humans is not motivated by anger at all. It's motivated by desire, because it's killing of animals. Most farmers probably don't hate the cows or the sheep or whatever that they kill, or fishermen hate their fish. They just want to eat them and make money out of it. And of course there's the ignorance of the fact that, the suffering that they're creating is really bad for their own karma. A big bit of ignorance behind all of these, really. So all of these must have some unwholesome state driving it. Now this, when later on we get to say a bodhisattva interpretation, like there is a different interpretation there. Right, we see this idea of, for example, everyone brings up the example of the bodhisattva that kills, the one bad guy in order to save the lives of 100 other innocent people. Is always the example that comes up. And true, this is a story in the scriptures. I don't want to get into this now, but I will say a couple of things about the story, because you've probably heard the story. So, they're on the ship, and the bodhisattva, and there's a whole bunch of merchants, and the bodhisattva knows that one of them is like a bad guy who's planning on killing all the others and taking all their wealth. And he instead decides, and he knows that, if this person does a really bad karma for that one person, so he in turn kills that bad guy and saves everyone else's lives. Now, in the story, there's many different versions of the story, and some of the versions, the earliest versions, the bodhisattva gets bad karma from killing that person and suffers. Later versions, it's considered good karma. So even the way in which this whole idea was interpreted, changed over time, and definitely keep that in mind, right? Because sometimes people laud the stories it's a virtue to kill the baddies. The earliest version, it's not a version. The earliest version is not a virtue. It still has this bad result. But also, this is one story. There's very few other stories in the Buddhist canon, and we got to be a bit careful about, when there's 1,000 stories saying don't kill, don't kill, don't kill, and we pick out the one exception and we give a huge amount of emphasis to that. Be very, very careful about that. Okay, don't let that one case overwhelm otherwise very clear evidence to not kill. Okay, so these are then precepts by nature. Taking alcohol, well, here literally actually the text doesn't say intoxicants, it says drinking alcohol, drinking wine. And in the early text, this is just this principle of wine, sura meria. There's two types. One is basically like fruit derived alcohol, one is grain derived alcohol. Maybe this is just in ancient India, they just had two different terms for it. Whereas nowadays in English we have one term, alcohol, which covers all of these things. But do notice now it's just alcohol. Now, let's just even talk about this term itself. A lot of modern writers, and I think particularly on the Chinese side, don't translate this into English as alcohol. They translate it as intoxicants. And it's a bit problematic in some ways. It's probably just about as problematic as the term drug, right? So don't take drugs. Well, what constitutes a drug? It's quite vague, right? You know, it's not just illicit drugs. And if we try to take the idea of, if something is illegal, then it's a drug and don't take it, that will not work for Buddhism. Why? Because almost everywhere alcohol's legal. So if that was the case, then it would totally go against this whole principle of don't consume alcohol, right? So legality does not equal morality. We have to be a bit clear about that. So, you know, okay, don't take crack cocaine. It's not healthy for you or the people around you. Okay, most of us are going to agree with that. What about some other, you know, coffee? Coffee's a drug. Smoking cigarettes. Cigarettes is another interesting example, in that in many of the Theravada countries, they won't include that in this category here. I said, well, the text doesn't say that, it says alcohol. But most of the, say, East Asian traditions, they will include it in that category. So this is a real tough one, like what things are prohibited here and what things are not. To answer this, I think we need to look at the reason, why is this a precept in the first place? And as you can see here, the text says, as consuming intoxicants or as drinking alcohol destroys many virtues. Bai zong de. The idea being, the original idea being, when one takes alcohol, it literally interferes with our ability to restrain ourselves. Anyone who's been around anyone drinking knows this very clearly. If we look at, for example, let's just talk about alcohol, you know, the amount of alcohol prevalent in domestic violence and other assault charges, it's massively high. People do stupid things when they're drunk that they wouldn't normally do. It's commonly known. And this was the basic principle why alcohol was prescribed by the Buddha. Not that getting drunk itself is necessarily evil or bad. I mean, it creates ignorance because when you're under the influence, you're not clear in the head. But you're not hurting other people in general. But one's ability to think ethically and act ethically is impaired. And that was the reason. So if we take this as the criteria, and I think this is kind of an important principle to keep in mind, then what kinds of other drugs or intoxicants in a broader sense have a similar result? That's what we need to think of. So, you know, if you think of an example like, okay, what about amphetamines, crack cocaine, meth? Yeah, it does. I mean, nowadays you hear so many stories about some person high on crack cocaine becoming horribly violent and engaging in just like these horrific types of actions. It seriously impairs. It seems to generate like anger and lust, and then people are acting out on that really compulsively because it's so addictive. So I definitely put that in that category. But then there's other things that don't. I mean, you drink a lot of coffee, maybe you get a bit kind of like spacey and talk too much, but I don't really hear about people doing like ethically dodgy things because they've drunk too much coffee. Okay, I'm sure someone can think of an example, but not as a whole. So I think this is kind of like a good principle to do that. Of course, any type of drug or anything that affects the mind, you still got to also reflect about, you know, if that's affecting your mind, then is it good for your practice as well? Does it bring us clarity or does it bring us sort of confusion and ignorance? It's a basic principle. But just bringing about ignorance is itself not sufficient to be given under this class of morality or ethics, because there's lots of other things that do that as well, right? Probably watching too many TikToks or YouTube videos is probably going to make your head all like mushy because you're going to be overstimulated as well. But we don't ban that as like an ethical principle. We need to talk about that when we're talking about developing meditation, restraining the senses, etc., etc. That's like a bit of a higher sort of demand. Okay, so let's just go through this one more line again. Using oneself as an example, assess the feelings of others. So this is our basic principle. If I'm engaging in a way, would I like others to do that? Would I like others to do that to me? If not, then I'm going to refrain from it. Some broad categories include killing, violence in general, theft, taking the possessions of others, engaging in sexual misconduct with others. And of course, it's not just necessarily the person that you're engaging in the sexual acts with, it also includes other people around them, right? So a consensual sexual relationship with somebody else's spouse is a no-no. Even though it's consensual between those two people, it's of course going to very seriously harm that other person's spouse. So thinking of the feelings of others is not just, you have to think broadly there too. False statements, lying, deceiving, etc. And then consuming, what we're going to put here is intoxicants, which, the types of intoxicants that impede our own ability to act ethically and restrain ourselves. These are the precepts that we should uphold. So these are our basic categories here for the 5 precepts. I think that's about enough for today. We've gone over time. So we're going to deal with this next week, the 5 precepts, just talking about upholding these for life, and that's the basis for all merit. And we're also going to talk about the 8-fold fasting precepts and the 10 paths of wholesome action. When we get to the end of that there, it's probably be next week, then we're going to get into meditation. Okay, good stuff. So that's what we've got coming up for you all, everyone. Thank you for joining in today. Time's up, so I'm going to sign out for now, and we'll see you back again next week. If you've got any questions, of course, throw them in the old chat box here, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.